It is with great pleasure that I open this second meeting of the series Nothing is Ever Lost, in memory of the Italian sociologist with whom several of us had the privilege of working before he is ultimately passing in early 2014, Massimo Rosati. The series is conceived to mark these 10 years precisely and follows past annual editions of what we have called Massimo Rosati seminars. Each meeting in this series features a dialogue around the themes, the issues that have been most passionate about his work and that his work has taught us to see as a key for social science and beyond. The theme of sacred space has been extensively explored in Massimo Rosati's work, and it's also a focus of one of the research lines in our center in FBK. In the book he had just completed and that has been published posthumously for Routledge, The Making of a Post-Secular Society, a Durkheimian Approach to Memory, Pluralism and Religion in Turkey, a project that aimed to merge the reflection on Durkheimian categories of the sacred and ritual with the notion of the post-secular. The spatiality and grammar of sacred places are discussed according to these Durkheimian categories and later applied to the Turkish laboratory. His theoretical reflection that he proposed in this book also continued a line of research that he had cultivated and that was well described, expressed in an article published by Rosati in 2012, titled Post-Secular Sanctuaries Towards a Neo-Durkheimian Grammar of Sacred Places, published in the Italian journal Etnografia e Ricerca Qualitativa. So I will briefly introduce his reading of the sacred space because before introducing the host, the guest that we are with great pleasure hosting today. Rosati's reading of sacred space is embedded in his overall remark on the symbolic dimension of social life. In his appropriation of an old-fashioned model, that of center-periphery, as formulated by Edward Shields in the well-known essay Center and Periphery, Rosati defends the usefulness of the logic of this dichotomy in still providing criteria for interpreting societies in the face of any postmodernist temptation. Even, or rather precisely, the new structure of the so-called network societies would clearly reveal within it the renewed need for symbolic references. New and multiple symbols are indeed confronted, but they are still symbols, which must also manifest themselves spatially. The tension between center and periphery, moreover, can be considered just like that between the sacred and profane as one of the main axes upon which the construction of social life and social reality rests. It is again the Durkheimian tradition, supplemented by a selected contemporary literature following the so-called special turn, that supports Rosati's reconstruction of the specific properties of sacred places and their fundamental grammar. What distinguishes a sacred place as the result of ritual practices of consecration in specific historical circumstances is its ability to give rise to an experience of transcendence, or to reflect through symbolic references an otherworldly order, a transcendent dimension, perfect or desirable. Rosati highlights as a characteristic of sacred places their role as points of encounter between the two orders. The materiality that comprises these places, especially elements like gates, doors, ritual practices which construct the boundaries, can evidently be considered symbols of connection between the two orders. This very marked interpretation of the sacred and sacred space, however, is cast in the context of plurality in Rosati's studies, as the symbolic system in general. In plural societies, the center transfers and multiplies through dynamics of change and delocalization, without losing its orienting function for society. To read this dynamic in contemporary times, Rosati resorts the key of the post-secular, which he analyzes and puts to the test in various venues as a possible non-deterministic interpretation of the more general evolution of the relationship between religion and modernity in Western societies. What I would like to emphasize here is his idea, in line with the studies of Kim Nocht, for example, that the notion of the post-secular implies a series of elements, all susceptible to spatialization. In other words, the analysis of the spatialization of religion emerged as a fundamental ingredient in the sociological development of the idea of the post-secular. Where the post-secular is spatialized in what Rosati calls post-secular sanctuaries, symbolism undergoes an hybridization between different universes of meaning. Ritual practices give rise to new symbolic constellations, thus new centers and new relationships between centers and peripheries, capable of overcoming the logic of separation between the secular and the religious. So, taking no further time, these points, we think these points echo in the albeit different reading of the sacred space that our guest, woman will immediately let Paolo introduce, will propose to us today. So I thank him very much for accepting our invitation today, and immediately leave the floor to Paolo Costa to introduce our guest.
Hope you can hear me.
So it's muted.
You can hear me now? Let's see.
Yeah.
You can hear me now? Oh, you can hear me. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, of course, I'm very glad to introduce Nikolas Kompridis, our guest today. He's a friend, a philosopher, is here in Trento, is visiting Trento thanks to cooperation with the Department of Philosophy of the University of Trento, and has been here for a couple of days and has already given 2 talks, so we are very grateful for his effort, this last effort today. Well, who is Nikolas? Nikolas Kompridis is a multidisciplinary philosopher and social theorist, and the focus of his investigations are, the main focuses of his investigations are 3. The first one is the relation between the human and non-human, a topic on which he gave a talk at the university yesterday evening. The second one is the goal of revising the theory and practice of critique of social, critique in light of diverse tradition of critical theory. And the third and last is philosophical romanticism, understood as a key tradition in modern culture. Another aspect of his investigation of his research, one that which we're going to benefit from today, is his familiarity and interest in arts, and especially in cinema. Yeah, and today he will give us a proof of that. As for his scientific output in terms of book, especially, I want to mention here his three most important books: Critique and Disclosure, the collection of essays, the very important collection of essays, Philosophical Romanticism, and the third one, The Aesthetic Turn in Political Thought. But he has published articles and book chapters in leading journals and important notable academic practice. He has taught at university in Canada, in the UK, and Australia, and is currently a fellow and associate faculty at the Center for Ethics at the University of Toronto, the city he comes from and where he's going back to in a couple of days. So thanks again, Nikolas, for being with us this afternoon, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, Valeria, and thank you, all of you. I guess I'm looking at you now. It's an honor to be given this opportunity to share my work in a lecture series dedicated to Massimo Rosati, who obviously was a tremendous scholar of sacred space, and just as obviously a very dear friend to all of you. So I'm humbled by the opportunity to share this space with him. I had the opportunity to read one paper that Valeria sent me, the one on post-secular sacred spaces, which I found very, very interesting. In some ways, it reassured me that I had done my research well, because many of the texts that he was systematizing into his own particular view of sacred space were texts I had consulted, classical texts and more contemporary texts. I had three things that crossed my mind while reading his text. One was whether the kind of sacred space I discuss in my paper analyzing a West African tradition of asylum called sacred space fits into his construction of the moral grammar of sacred spaces. So one question that I might be interested in hearing an answer to is whether this, those of you who know his work really well, would consider the kind of space I'm going to talk about today one that fits into his moral grammar model. And then I want to say that because I started from a very different place, I started from an early essay by Michel Foucault called Other Spaces, or Different Spaces in English translation, where he introduces the notion of heterotopia. I'll come to that in a minute. The reason I did all the research I did after I read that essay as a way to think about how I was going to interpret this film, I realized that what Foucault proposed was very suggestive, but also very thin and unfulfilled. So I dove into all the literature that Massimo Rosati thematizes in this text. Not all of it, but most of it. And I think there is something still that's distinct to Foucault's approach that I hope comes out in my talk, and what I made of it, I hope. And finally, I pick up something in Durkheim that I don't know if it appears in the body of work that Rosati left behind, but I found it to be the most interesting part of Durkheim's book, and I'll come to that at the end. So this is about a half hour, 35 minutes, and why do I look there? Because you're over. And I hope you enjoy this. So the film that was the subject of my investigation and kicked off my whole interest out of nowhere, starting from nothing, in sacred space, was the film of the great Senegalese master who passed away in 2009, Ousmane Sembène. His last film was called Moulade. Sembène more or less founded African cinema after the decolonization period in the 1960s. Sub-Saharan Africans were allowed to make movies for the first time since the beginning of cinema. So what I'm about to present comes from this book chapter, which is itself a larger project, a book I call Heterotopic Cinema, Fugitive Spaces of Refuge and Freedom. There are 3 chapters to the book, one on Moulade, and the other 2 are on Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up and Nicholas Ray's Johnny Guitar, 3 very different films, all of which animate, rather illuminate a heterogeneous class of social spaces that are at once utopian and actual, which manifest a transformative non-human agency. The spaces have an agency of their own through which they prefigure more just and more capacious forms of human life. Now, I know that utopian side of sacred space was of interest to Rosati. I think I develop it in a different way, or, again, based on the little I know of his work. The title of my book comes from the name Michel Foucault gave to these spaces in that brief, short essay, suggestive essay he wrote in 1967 for a public lecture given to architecture scholars and architects. But it wasn't published in his lifetime. It was published in 1984 after he died. His discussion of heterotopic space is replete with promising suggestions about their complexity, their complexly entangled social and political significance. Unfortunately, they were sketched in a mostly improvisational manner and remained undeveloped until his untimely death. However, the idea of heterotopia has retained a remarkable generative power, and it is open to development in multiple, even contradictory directions. I take the contrary, not contradictory, directions. I take the concept in a more utopian direction, emphasizing its transformative power. And if you don't like the term transformative, I could say I take it in a more political direction. Now, there's something about these spaces I want to say right away, and it is prompted by the situation in contemporary life where it is more and more the case that we feel less and less safe to say or do what we care about, to express opinions that might be dissenting or critical, and to live in ways that might not be conforming to existing social norms. So my idea, what's driving this book, is the realization that these spaces of refuge and freedom, were they to be erased from the earth, none of us would be safe. And that's what these films, to me, bring to my mind very forcefully, that we need these spaces, and that they will be always in need of being created anew again and again. So to take the idea of heterotopia in this direction, one must identify more clearly and cogently than Foucault did the 2 features of heterotopic spaces that make them heterogeneous, constitutively heterogeneous to other social spaces. And this overlaps, but also differs from Rosati's grammar, let's say. First, heterotopic spaces are spaces in which is incarnated a partially realized and inescapably impermanent utopia, a transitory utopia, whose existence is at once actual, it's really here and now, and possible, pointing to something in the future that is yet to come. It is actual because as incarnate, it exists already here and now. As Foucault put it, heterotopias are actually realized utopias. They are already here in that form. But as he failed to understand, to my mind, heterotopias are also unrealized utopias. They are necessarily nascent at the birth stage, imperfect and transitory. In this sense, a heterotopia exists in the here and now, and at the same time does not exist. It exists in the not yet. It exists as realized and as ever not yet realized. Ontologically speaking, its existence as a space which is not yet is, however, no less real, no less present as a genuine possibility. Possibilities are also real. So, no less present as a genuine possibility than that without which it cannot appear at all, the incarnated space in which it already is. Only a perfectly realized utopia could be a dystopia. An actually realized utopia would therefore be indistinguishable from a dystopia. It would be indistinguishable from a dystopia because a perfectly and permanently realized utopia would, by definition, foreclose the future. It would deny the very possibility of the future because we have arrived at the end of time. That would be tantamount then to a denial of human agency, altogether annulling its freedom to fashion an alternative future for itself. For without the ever not yet, the idea of utopia is utterly bereft of the promise of the future, the idea of the future as a promise. The second distinctive element of heterotopic spaces is their agentic character. They act on and alter other social spaces, showing how they do so in very different but equally compelling ways in the film I referred to today, Semben's Mulade, but also in Antonio's Blow Up and Raise Johnny Guitar, is the principal preoccupation of my book. Each of their distinctive heterotopic spaces manifest a transformative non-human agency. Sorry. My laptop suddenly went dark. Okay. A transformative non-human agency capable of altering what takes place inside them and in the spaces that surround them. Apparently inscrutable and resistant to human intervention, their agentic power both impels and enables human agents to act in previously unexpected ways, producing crucial and far-reaching changes to their self-understanding and to their social and political circumstances. In Mulada, the invocation of a sacred space of refuge not only offers temporary sanctuary for young girls fleeing a purification ceremony, in other words, a ceremony of genital circumcision in a West African village, it also possesses a vexatious political agency of its own, unsettling the patriarchal rule in the village and prompting decolonizing reflection on the inherited violence of colonialism. Now, if you read Foucault, sacred spaces and heterotopic spaces are more or less indistinguishable. For as Foucault pointed out in his essay, his idea of heterotopic space is one that is based on the thought that heterotopic spaces retain a residue of the sacred, a reminder that space, unlike time, has not been entirely desacralized. We enter such spaces, be it a library, a concert hall, or a temple, with a degree of reverence commensurate to them. Consider even how an ordinary park can function altogether mundanely as a sacred space without any need of religious underpinning. It is itself a protected space with defined boundaries, and at the same time, a space that offers refuge and protection to anyone that enters it, from strollers looking for relief from the noisy pace of urban life to homeless people looking for a safer place to spend the night. From the moment it is invoked in the film to secure provisional refuge for these terrified pre-adolescent girls unwilling to undergo the ritual of purification, mulade, the West African word, well, the specific West African language, which means sacred space, triggers a cascading series of dissident and unruly actions, enabling one very courageous woman's public contestation of the practice of female genital cutting. Overturning the spatial and normative order of the village, mulade goes far beyond just protecting the young girls within it. It actively permeates and unsettles the spaces around it, paralyzing the customary exercise of authority in the village. It turns into what Rosati argues based on the classical text. It becomes the new center of the village, even though, don't look there, even though it's a private home, because of its effect on the other spaces, the public square is no longer the center of the village. This house where the sacred space is invoked becomes the center and the public square becomes the periphery. The destabilizing effects radiating outward from mulade can be set in motion only because for a brief, evanescent moment, it simultaneously transcends and undermines all secular power and authority and other sacred powers present in the life of this village. It is in Latin supra legem, and it is above the law, not subject to the law. It operates over and above any existing or extant laws. So this is interesting. It's above the law. That's a very important part of this picture of sacred space that I am working with. And then there's another part, and that is that anyone can invoke sacred space. It doesn't have to be someone who is an official of a religion or of a cult, in this case, but for the standing she enjoys through marriage to one of the wealthy families in the village. The main character, Kole, is in every other respect an ordinary woman, lacking any special secular or religious status or any special training. This tells us that mulada, this kind of sacred space, can be invoked by anyone, anywhere. It is radically democratic. No power has to be invested in you to declare this space temporarily as a sacred space. And yet, as extraordinary as the power of mulada is shown to be in the film, because it is supported by a very old ancient African religion, which has a power of sanction. To violate this space is to risk a sanction that can be quite violent and fatal. So the way it is represented, though, is also very important to me. It is fastidiously represented in the film in the most ordinary, utterly mundane ways. To publicly mark the threshold that's just so important in the literature on sacred space, separating mulade from the profane space around it, Kole draws a braided tri-colored rope across the doorless entrance of her family home. But why does it do that? It's very interesting. It just suddenly, there's lots of battery. Okay, sorry. She draws this rope across the doorless entrance of their home, which is barely a foot off the ground. I'm going to try and show it to you. I have a photo of it and see if it's captured on the camera. Can you can I just get does it even show? Probably not. Maybe this direction? Maybe you can do it.
Let me try, maybe with paper.
Doesn't matter. I can describe it. Oh yeah, that's good. That's better. Keep going, but keep going. Keep going, that's good. Yeah, so that's the entrance, and down below is just this ordinary little rope. That's the threshold. And it is powerful enough that nobody steps over it unless they live in that home. There are no witnesses when she draws this robe, and there are no rituals or ritual-like gesture to note that something out of the ordinary is taking place. What is going on with my computer? It all looks so unremarkable, so disarmingly unremarkable that one may fail to notice it altogether. But the filmmaker is prompting us to notice how the ordinary and the extraordinary, how the profane and the sacred here are not separated by a distinct boundary, but barely a boundary, in order to get the point across, I think, that the two are both distinct and intertwined. Not one or the other, but both. In spite of its quiet, unobtrusive ordinariness, or because of it, this mischievously humble piece of rope effortlessly absorbs the sacred power of Mulade, precisely marking and at the same time muddling the boundary. It's a sacred boundary, but people are going over it. People who live in the home, who are carrying on their ordinary family life, but people who aren't living in the home are precluded from entering it. Contrary to the essentialist criteria of classic formulations of the difference between the sacred and profane, like Mircea Eliade, the boundary demarcating the sacred space of Mulade is neither strict nor fixed, nor is there any ontological differentiation of levels of being, of higher and lower. Only Mulade's virtually inconspicuous occupation of the domestic space of this family home, the domestic space of the care work which women do in this home, remains in place. It does not uniformly and unambiguously mark the threshold of the holy or the hieros in the strict sense. They do not appear. What does appear is a sacred space that can be permeated by the profane and yet retain its distinctness, emanating an inviolable, not invariable, but inviolable otherness of its own. You know it's not homogeneous space. It is marked as sacred, but in this very ordinary way, let's put it. Just as messianic and revolutionary time interrupts homogeneous empty time, as Walter Benjamin showed us, sacred space interrupts homogeneous, undifferentiated space. Its heterogeneity is constitutive of its power, not only to demarcate itself from profane space, but all the more importantly, to reorder space and to alter the relation between existing spaces. This is how a newly evoked space becomes, as Van der Leeuw put it, the fixed point, the central axis for all future orientation. So this humble courtyard of the family home becomes this new fixed point, the new central axis for all future orientation in the film, in the life of this village. Now, typically, scholars of sacred space, what Rosati usefully calls the essentialist conception of sacred space, think of sacred space as permanently fixed in place by physically unambiguous and unchanging boundaries, so temples, churches, stone monuments. But a reordering and reorientation of space can also follow from the spontaneous, temporally discontinuous designation of a sacred space. And this is what makes Semben's portrayal of Mulade, this ancient African tradition of asylum, both fascinating and illuminating. Now, recent scholars have taken a more robustly historical and comparative, and in a sense, and by that I mean a non-essentialist approach to sacred space that curiously in about every respect corresponds to the picture of sacred space presented by Semben. The political aspect of sacred space is not anterior to the sacred. It's not external to it. It is essential to its constitution. There is always power and politics in the constitution of a sacred space. But rather than fixed in a particular space by some hierophonic or hierophanic event, Sacred space can be mobile, set free to appear, if only temporarily, wherever it is invited or invoked. So that's the third different characteristic that I want to point out, that sacred spaces can be invoked anywhere, anytime, by anyone, at any time. And they don't have to be permanent physical spaces. Just dealing with my fussy computer. All right. So,
Style.
critics of Iliad and van der Leeuw have claimed, not altogether correctly, that power is, as an essential element of the sacred, is entirely missing from their analyses. In a text contemporaneous with Iliad's The Sacred and the Profane, van der Leeuw aptly describes sacred space as a center of power positioned in place where its effects become perceptible. So it becomes a locus of power. And to do so, the sacred has to settle in a space, this is very important, already occupied by others. My computer has gone mad. It just keeps going dark on me. And therefore, the settlement of the sacred, where it settles into a space, is always a conquest. And as we know, that often means violent conquest. Iliad had no problem actually recognizing that the consecration of sacred space always involved, this is from The Sacred and Profane, conquering and inhabiting a territory already inhabited by other human beings. You put the cross down, and it is now ours. It has been both claimed, reoccupied, and renamed. Indeed, the consecration of land already inhabited by other human beings during the era of Western colonialism or European colonialism became the performative foundation of colonial dispossession, consecration as dispossession. Iliad talks about this moment as a moment of new birth for some and a death for others. But is a genuine new birth even possible in a space settled by conquest and dispossession? For if consecrating an already occupied space is equivalent to creating it anew, without the freely given consent and equal participation of other human beings who already inhabit this land, how can it be created anew? Otherwise, the new birth would be absorbed into yet another round of violent reoccupation and dispossession, a stillbirth, not a new birth. We are much too familiar with this cycle of violence. It is taking place as we speak in two countries not far away from here. We know what they are. Spaces of refuge answered the need for spaces that can hold the line against oppressive regimes, against violent treatment of human beings, and which they could only hold because those spaces of refuge were once regarded as supra legem, above secular law and beyond the reach of sovereign power. Just what they space is captured in the literal meaning of the Greek word from which our term asylum comes, asulia. And its meaning is based on the way that the Greek language and now the English language will change the meaning of a word by introducing the letter A in front of it. So political, apolitical, social, asocial, and so on. So the Greek word is asileia or silon, and it means not subject to seizure. That once you're in this space, you cannot be taken by a sovereign political power. Much like asylum spaces in pre-classical Greece, Mulada answers the call for an inviolable heterogeneous space, literally a space of otherness where one is not subject to seizure. The call arises whenever and wherever untethered power is at liberty to cross the last remaining line protecting human beings from inhuman treatment. When no fixed space of refuge is available, that space must be called forth spontaneously with equal inviolability. Unlike spaces, asylum spaces in pre-classical Greece and early Christianity, the space of mulata is not fixed to a dedicated space of refuge with which it is identified, be it a temple or a church, nor does it depend on the authority of a specific religious or spiritual institution in Delphi or in the early church, whose sacred spaces are administered by institutionally appointed officials, priests, priestesses, church officials. Therefore, to speak of a mulata as a centerless center of power, right, it's a centerless center of power because it's not fixed, is to capture its spontaneous mobility, its dynamism, and agentic qualities. Speaking of it in these terms more fully captures its radically democratic character. It's radically democratic because it is a space that can be invoked by anyone, anywhere, anytime, and it can become the vehicle through which a community of people expresses its democratic will. I want to show you a little 2-minute clip, stop looking there, a 2-minute clip of a protest by Occupy protesters at the University of California, Davis, back in 2011, when the previous day students had been pepper sprayed on the orders of the university president. Now, I talk about this in a paper of mine called don't show it just yet. I talk about this paper at the end of a publication of mine called Founding Critique in an Age of, I forget, anyway, it's easy to find, an attempt to renew the utopian dimension of critique. So I use this then because it seemed to me to be an interesting, very powerful instance of how critique can be receptive rather than assertive. In this moment, you'll see, in this little clip, you'll see that the university students created a space on the university campus. They reoccupied it. They lined their space, the space they occupied, with candles and sat there very quietly. It created a space through which the university president had to walk. And this is the president that the day before ordered a violent suppression of the protests. So let's watch this, and I'll comment on it quickly after. You can see the people, they're not saying a word. And of course, the president and her retinue are not speaking either. They've been silenced by the space. They're walking reverentially. The president is on the left. So what they just asked her, the journalist, is, were you threatened by the students at all? And she said, no, I was not threatened at all. But the day before, she was so threatened that she ordered the university police on these students and beat them up and sprayed pepper spray all over them. So This is an instance of silencing. They didn't silence her by saying, you cannot speak now. You have lost the right to speak. They silenced her the way one is silenced when one walks into Chartres Cathedral. They're silenced by the reverential atmosphere of the space. It's a university campus, but here for a few seconds, a few minutes, they occupied this space without conquering it. They did so in a radically democratic way. They didn't criticize, they didn't attack her for what she did the day before, which they were surely entitled to do. They kept quiet and they silenced her by the powers of this reverential space, which to me is what is politically significant about sacred spaces, that they could have that power and change how one acts, how one thinks when one is in that space. So when she says, I never felt threatened, this admission given freely empties any justification she had before for her violence-fostering response to the students. In other words, this admission, call it an acknowledgement about that is brought about non-violently and non-coercively, is the effect of this spontaneous emergence of this heterotopic space.
We don't need to show.
No, thank you, Asha, you made that clear. And in a way, a sacred space like this creates the conditions of its own receptivity. The silent protesters manifested for the university another way to think about her own actions. They made an argument through this sacred space that also actualized its utopian, however temporary, character. For a moment there, we can see the possibility of another way of resolving conflict, another way of understanding when we have become a danger to each other, and how coming back, walking through this space, can pull us back from the precipice of violent action. So I'm going to leave that for now and close off the discussion by reference to Foucault and to Durkheim. One could safely assume that Foucault would have recognized Mulata, the film and the practice, as an exemplary and remarkable instance of a heterotopia. However, other than to claim that heterotopias are animated by a silent or hidden sacralization, Foucault regrettably did not offer an account of the sacred that could explain its persistence across centuries of ongoing desacralization. There's no account, just intuition he had. Foucault had so many intuitions that you would need an army of researchers to fulfill their promising lines of inquiry. So in spite of its uncanny congruence with Semben's recreation of Mulata practice, Foucault's intriguing characterization of heterotopias is unable to elucidate how heterotopic space, sacred space, can be animate, a catalyst for normative change that is at the same time a medium for collective democratic action, as we saw in that brief instance at the University of California, Davis campus. The questions that Foucault failed to address in his promising essay on space were the very questions that concerned Emile Durkheim in his final work, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. The sacred was precisely what Durkheim wanted to understand and explain, not as an account of religion and secularization in the first place, but as an account of the constitution of new bonds of sociality and new social institutions through, as Hans Joas put it, extraordinary collective expressive action. So that's my take on Durkheim. I think there's other Durkheim scholars, obviously, who read it that way. Certainly not my teacher Habermas, but it's what's at issue in it is how new social institutions and new bonds of solidarity come into being. It is precisely this moment of founding a new normative order that Durkheim called the sacred. The sacred is not something that originates in the distant past, becoming an incongruous residue of some withering and soiled tradition, nor is it something which mature societies eventually outgrow through processes of rational enlightenment and secularization. The sacred, in this very different sense, must be recreated anew in response to new historical conditions and challenges. Thus, whatever we call the sacred, quoting now from the translator of the New English edition of Durkheim, herself an anthropologist, is inherently impermanent and so must be added to the object again and again, just as it was originally. Inherently impermanent and needs to be added again. The sacred has to be added again to the object, just as it was originally. Which leads to a surprising conclusion, which I formulate in the following way. The sacred cannot be desacralized in principle. If the possibility of new forms of freedom, new forms of sociality, and new social structures depends upon the successful rearticulation and re-embodiment of the sacred, then there can be no final and permanent desacralization of the sacred unless human history comes to an end. However, the sacred in this Durkheimian sense cannot be added to anything at all without adding its equiprimordial counterpart, the ideal. So the ideal and the sacred are complementary parts of the same process. Together, they constitute the distinctively human additions to the real, to what we experience as real, quoting from Durkheim. What defines the sacred is that the sacred is added to the real. And since the ideal is defined in the same way, we cannot explain the one without explaining the other. A society can neither create itself nor recreate itself without at the same time creating some kind of ideal by the same stroke. This creation is the act by which society makes itself and remakes itself periodically. This is the last paragraph. Beginning from very different starting points, Durkheim and Ousmane Sembène converge on an altogether distinctive conception of the sacred. As I have argued in my reading of Sembène's film, the heterotopic space of Mulata is not only animated by an idea of the sacred with the power to suspend, neutralize, or reverse relations between existing social spaces. It is also animated by a supra-legem ideal of justice through which new spaces of refuge and freedom can be instituted. Today, when the refugee camp represents the catastrophic inversion of sacred space, the epitome of a desacralized, which is to say, of a depoliticized and self-enclosing space, Sembène's film, Sembène's Mulata, rescues an image of sacred space as an actually realized utopia. For without an image of an actually realized utopia, we cannot think anew the act by which society remakes itself. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikolas. Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. We have, I think, all of us have in mind some connections, or with the way Massimo Rosati has framed this important field of analysis and study. I think we had organized this session in a very dialogical form. So thank you for having saved time for our discussion. Me and Paolo have some first questions, and then we are very glad to open the floor to all of you that are participating remotely. quickly to your questions. So maybe Paolo, if you want to start our conversation, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Valeria. Thank you, Nikolas. Also for giving me the opportunity to go back in time, yes, and think about Massimo and his legacy. Well, for me, there's also an opportunity to try to genealogically understand what may look like a strange fact about Massimo, that of course he started as I started as a critical theorist, very young, very promising, not me, critical theorist. When we met at the beginning, it was the early 1990s. Of course, what moved us? Yeah, what moved us? What made us think that philosophy or sociology could be a good life, a good instance, the best instance of a good life? Well, the usual stuff, as it were. We wanted to know how another world is possible. So that was the idea. But then what happened to Massimo? What happened? Well, of course, it happened, the institution, of course, and then is the institution means finding a topic of research, and it's interesting that he began to study what we could call the political sacred, yes, the community. For example, he studied the history of Italian identity, Risorgimento, and the way, of course, the nation has been sacralized in time. And he may have been dissatisfied with that, of course, and he didn't find an option in the usual Rawlsian way out. I mean, the procedural or, yes, that kind of immunization of the sacred political space. And he went in another direction. What was that direction? It's interesting. This is my first question, is when I think about it, and I thought about it in these days, of course, it came back to me that for Massimo, especially in our friendly conversation, in the interstices of time of work, the as if, the als ob was a sort of pattern for him. Yes. So the idea is that we encounter reality as a possibility in the actual experience of reality, and that experience is it might have been otherwise, of course, and it might have been better, even in the darkest moments in time. And for him, I always thought that for him, that was a core existential, not just philosophical or sociological insight. Yes, so my question is precisely about this aspect of your reading of the sick. There is a moment of hierophany. There, of course, something crops up, and this something is in Arendt's term is for example, it may be epiphany of a form of justice or freedom that you usually don't find in your life. So heterotopian is a nice term to call these alternative possibilities. So we sort of we close the circle in a sense here, and you can see that there this experience of this very ordinary experience of the sacred can be so a form of disclosure and a phenomenon. And if I can ask you, what strikes me in your so useful interpretation of Sembene's movie is that, and I don't see it in my work, and I don't know if there is something like that, because of course there could have been different examples of sacredness. For example, Pentecostalism is such a crucial religious contemporary experience for many scholars, many researchers, precisely, I think, because of an aspect of their experience of the sacredness that you pointed to. So the idea that you can produce the sacred in the ordinary and you don't have a very specific side in the world. So the Holy Spirit is important for the Pentecostal. But Massimo, I don't think was very much impressed by Pentecostal, was impressed by the Jews. Okay, so what happens in the Jewish experience of the sacred? If I, following Ansio's insight or understanding, there is a potential for, yes, for correcting these, of course, the sacralization of community, of course. There is a reading of Durkheim as a sort of, yeah, sacralization of a nation, of course, and that's not what Massimo saw in Durkheim's. But in your, and I close my first question, in your choice of Sembene, I was very impressed by the role of care, space of care. Yeah, the sacred is marked by the care in its polysemy. Yeah, I mean, being careful, of course, that's a typical quality of these sacred spaces. You have to be careful, but careful is a very beautiful adjective. Qualifies human experience in them, but also caring about, of course. So these constellations and meanings of sacredness, I think that now when I think about Massimo, who was a careful person in all of his the senses, I think it is really it's relevant, and it's also revelatory in a sense. So, well, thank you also for bringing back this very important memories about Massimo. So, thank you.
Did you want me to answer?
Yeah, if you wanted to. Yeah, yes, exactly. If you want to.
So that's one of the really striking features of the film, that the invocation of Mulata, the invocation of the sacred space which will protect these young children, is in the courtyard of this typical West African household, which is kind of internally closed except for this gateway into which you enter it. And inside this courtyard, through the whole film, which is I meant to show with some verisimilitude, that most of the work that is being done in this courtyard is women's work, women's care work. They're looking after the household, they're looking after their children, they're making sure it's clean, they're making sure food is prepared. They're basically doing all the work. The men are absent, they're working in the fields or talking and getting angry. So why did he put it there? You know, he could have put it in any other place. You know, as the filmmaker, he had a choice where, but he put it there, I think, for a reason, partly because he really believed that the future of Africa depended on the empowerment and agency of women, which, you know, you could do in a very didactic way, which he didn't. But also because I think he believed that these traditions of asylum, these practices of creating spaces of refuge and freedom, are spaces that we have to take care of. Yeah. And so there's an interesting dialectic between the women and this sacred space. The sacred space, because of its agentic power, because now it is the center of village life. It's not the periphery, but the center is not just a place where women do their care work. It suddenly becomes the most politically powerful place in the village, because everyone now has to take account of the men, the chiefs of the village, the women who perform their sacred duties to purify young girls. Everyone has to be respectful. They can't enter the space, and they have to contend with its reordering of the spatial power of spatial order of the village. So their own agency is then given a force that didn't exist before, their care work becomes political. They speak out in ways they didn't before. They take risks in ways they didn't before. They challenge and critically engage the patriarchal structure of the village. At the same time, it's not a coincidence that the only people who take care of Mulata, who take care of the sacred space, are these women. They're the only ones who understand what's really at stake. And that's the dialectic of care and the sacred, and the gendered nature of that care, and the empowerment of a gender that is in the patriarchal structure always disempowered. So it was a really interesting kind of dialectic between these care practices and the practices of sacred space.
Thank you again, Nikolas. I would like to add just a question very much in line with Paolo's remarks, remaining still a minute on this constitutive aspects of the sacred space, and in particular on rituality. Because I think this is, as Paolo was outlining, kind of difference between your vision, your view on sacred space, and that of Massimo. I have the impression that he was trying in a way to solve a tension between the need to incorporate variety and plurality in the understanding of the sacred and of the sacred space on the one hand, and at the same time testing which are the fundamental elements that are common to the diverse cases that we can observe in our societies. So in a way, it could be a tension between traditions and modernity, a tension between exactly rituality and flexibility in a way that is. So your description of the analysis of the sacred space, and in particular of the refugee space, is very much about flexibility, in porous borders, and the extraordinary embedded in the ordinary space and life. It's very interesting, considering also the cases that we, for example, as a research group, are studying, like as we were talking before, multi-faith spaces or meditation rooms or silence room embedded in secular institutions. And so this was also very interesting for the area of Massimo. He was trying exactly to test how much in that cases the fundamental grammar of the sacred can resist, in a way, even considering, for example, virtuality and virtual spaces. And at the same time, I think he, in a similar way to your tone, he was very much aware of the political relevance of sacred sites. So his work, for example, on the case of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, was very much about the contested sacred sites. And there is a large literature also of an interdisciplinary character regarding these contested sacred sites. So, but again, he was always trying, also considering this political side, to remark how always also political struggles are struggles over the center, over the symbol that the center can express. And one of, I would say, the foundational aspect of this remarking the center in spaces was exactly rituality in his view. So I was wondering if you think that I mean, rituality can be replaced in a way by other ingredients. For example, in your reading of the refugee space for refugees, space for protection, in the essay that I read, it was meaningfully that the space for protection was a space for protection from rituality, from
From a particular,
yeah, exactly. So I was, and so the fundative element of sacredness, of the sacred character of that refugee space is ultimately normativity. So it's like a normative order. So yeah, I was wondering how, if it was your intention to remark that normativity can in a way replace rituality, and how we can read this in our societies that are, of course, normatively plural, in which conflicting norms are.
That's a very complex question, I think. It's very important. So, I think that rituals are very important, and the problem that deeply diverse societies or diversifying societies face is what rituals speak to across the plurality and diversity. So we probably need to invent these rituals through, accident and practice and experiment. And maybe we have some already. I do think that the film is not just this African practice does have a powerful symbolic character, and it does depend on the sanctioned power of the tradition of this practice, so that if you violate it, you risk punishment of some kind, either through the collective or some evil befalls your family. Now, there's an example from one of the historical texts I read about ancient asylum that took place in 6th century Athens. And this was a case when someone tried to overthrow the king of the city. I forget the name, but the point is, when his coup failed, he ran into the temple of a goddess and for protection. So long as he remained in that temple, he was safe. He and a few of his followers. But as the story is told, he left temporarily the sacred space of the temple, but he was tied to it by a rope, like this rope in the film, held onto the rope and stepped away from the temple. And that gave the king's soldiers the opportunity to seize him. They shouldn't have, because so long as he's tied to the temple, he's still connected to that sacred space. And when the king did that, he was strongly condemned and criticized, even by his followers, because he had violated that space. And in fact, his family was cursed. And a lot of bad things happened to them across generations. It is the same family line that leads to Pericles, the famous warrior and orator. His family line was cursed. Each generation, something horrible happened. I mean, what do you make of that? However, the belief that that can happen to you is powerful. So it's symbolic power. And in the village, there was also a king who violated the sacred asylum of Mulade, and he was buried in the village square. And over time, his body, his corpse, was overtaken by an anthill, which grew and grew and grew and grew to the height of a human being. So that also has a symbolic power and an almost ritual-like quality, because it's re-inscribing with each kind of cycle of growth, the original violation. So it's not entirely divorced from ritual and its symbolic underpinning. And in the case of the students who lined up in a column, one side and another, through which, the president had to walk, they sat down and they held candles. That's a very ritual-like gesture.
Yes.
It doesn't require massive religious foundation because everybody understands. It's cross-cultural. That when you hold a candle like that, there's something reverential being expressed. So they sit there with their candle in their hands and they're very quiet. And the quiet is part of the ritual. I mean, you enter a temple or a church, you don't talk. If you talk, you're violating the space. They sat quietly, and so it was a ritual-like gesture. But it wasn't a ritual that is located as a specific expression of this or that religion or this or that cult. So it's not entirely a departure from the exploration of how ritual defines and reinscribes or reinstates a sacred space. I think there is a place for ritual. I think ritual is necessary. The question is, how do we get rituals that speak to a pluralistic democratic society? I don't think it's beyond our reach.
Thank you. Complex dynamic with microphones here. Okay, thank you again, Nikolas. Since we have a lot of friends and colleagues connected, I will open the floor to possible questions from you, and maybe at the end we can come back. Is there any question? Okay, if not, maybe we can go on with Paolo.
Well, my second and last question is about, well, I'm sorry to bring bad words into our conversation, and we recording this, so well, I have to be careful. But I would like to ask you something about a concept, a notion that was important and for Massimo and Valeria, and mentioned it in your introduction, post-secularity. Yeah, sorry about that. In the essay, I don't think you mentioned it in your presentation. There is this distinctive character, this figure, this sort of modern African. This
Oh, yes.
We could call him sort of bourgeois. This new, it had worked in the US. Yeah, the mercenary. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I was wondering whether we could say that there is a sort of room, space for a standard triadic dialectical figure a la Hegel there. You may imagine the secularizing force of colonial powers producing an equal and opposite effect of counter-secularization in Africa. So there are these modernization and anti-modernization forces, and no either are able to heal the wounds of the past. And so they, in a sense, it is required a sort of creative reparative Aufhebung of these two opposite positions, which is, of course, past. I mean, it's not, in a sense, that is not merely stadial, is not, as Valeria said, is not that there's the next step in this philosophy of history. There is a sort of potential interpretation, understanding, of course, of our condition today. I was wondering whether we could describe, since we, in another series of webinars, we talking about disenchantment, enchantment. Yes, if there is if post-secularity can be understood also as a sort of way beyond disenchantment, and going back to the other two talks you gave, disenchantment and also disengagement, detachment, and that attitude that, of course, in Sembene's movie turns out to be not productive in terms of moral prowess. Of course, even if it's well intentioned, the human rights and the career of the human rights is at least ineffective in a sense. Is even powerless in a sense. So, and we know when we think about the last 2 decades, of course, the examples could be many of the both powerful and powerless quality of our human rights campaigns. Yeah. So if we want to use this beautiful word that Wendy Brown used, this adjective, so reparative in the sense that we want to repair something, and we imagine our goal as being reparative in this. Part of this act of repairment is also to stop a sort of disenchanting attitude towards the word and towards what people takes to be sacred. Yeah. So my question is,
I need to be very careful about what I say about Africa. I'm not an African specialist. Africa is not a field of study for me, but I do think we have to say that we're not talking about the same processes in Africa that we've seen take place in Western Europe, North America, and basically Western world. The global South is different, and each part of it is different from every other part of it. And parts of Africa are very different from other parts of Africa. What I can say is that Sembène had a very critical view of essentialist conceptions of Africa. So the first president of Senegal was the original theorist of negritude. Senghor, Leopold Senghor, was a French-educated, fluent in French, but not fluent in any African languages, president of Senegal, who thought that there was a pan-African identity that could be traced back, and part of the decolonizing process included reclaiming that identity. Sembène had no interest in that. He thought that was very wrong. But he did have an interest in reclaiming certain practices. He didn't want to reclaim all. That's why he made mulata. This sacred ritual of female purification, he didn't want to keep that going. He didn't want to renew it. He was very critical of it. And so he opposed it to another one. And so in the film, the two clash, two notions of the sacred clash. One which expresses the democratic will of the people, and the other which expresses the authority, top-down authority of patriarchal power. So he was interested in renewing certain practices, but not all. At the same time, he did not want simple importation of Western practices. Like he said a number of times in interviews, we have nothing to learn from Europe. We have nothing moral to learn from Europe. The Europeans are not moral exemplars for us. We have our own practices. They're messed up too, just like they are in Europe, but we'll figure them out. So that's very important. So it's like Gandhi, you know, this famous question they asked Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? And he said, it would be good. So I think that's important, but also it's important not to project processes that took place in the West onto what's going on in Africa. To speak of Africa as post-secular is weird, right? I just think it's an imposition of a category that does not fit there. What relation African religions and African practices that go way back to pre-colonial times have to contemporary Africa is very complicated, and I have no authority to speak about those. But what I do want to say is that we can't subsume them under our historical processes and see them as somehow being repeatable. The character mercenaire is a kind of a caricature of African modernity. He's a hustler, he's a liar, he hits on women, he charges too much for his goods, but he also was willing to risk his life as a former UN soldier to protect this woman when she was being publicly flogged by her husband. So he's a complicated person, and Sembène, because he's a great filmmaker and a great storyteller, makes him complicated. He's not easily dismissed. But it's a way of saying, well, this is a possible path for Africa. We could go the Western modernity route, or we could think about other routes for us that are, you know, more attuned to our history. And then there's also the process of decolonization. So it's not really, the central process there isn't secularization, it's decolonization. And what are the possible paths that can be taken, and which ones are good and which ones aren't so good. And so that's why I would be cautious about trying to reframe what's going on there in terms of the counts of secularization or post-secular societies that we have been that are in the Western discussion. I just don't think that they belong there.
Sad that it was bad.
No, but it's worth clarifying. It's worth, you know. Again, I'm not really the person to talk to about these things. It's not my. And if you're watching what's going on in Africa today, the way that these aggressive forms of militant Islam are going through West Africa, killing people, kidnapping young children, you know. Sembène was against the authoritarian figures that took over Africa after decolonization. As you know, Senghor was so angry with some of his films, he prevented him from making films for 10 years. They stopped showing his films. They seized his film roles, and you know, he suffered a lot for criticizing the authoritarian nature of post-decolonization African society. And, you know, it's still a mess. And, but again, I'm not the one to kind of illuminate that domain. I have no right to speak about that, except from the little I learned from working on this film.
Thank you.
If there are, in the meantime, some questions. In case, just raise your hand. Otherwise, I would have a last one. Going back again on space in particular, and I think that most of Massimo's reflection on space was about how space reflect social categories, social actions, and so on. And perhaps there is a less attention on the reversing the side and watching at how space in turn probably reshapes sociality and social reaction. So something that we were talking a little bit about before. And the more I read on spatial studies, the more I get that this is particularly, fruitful to watch, to examine how not only space is constructed by the social, but also the social is constructed by space. And I grasp some suggestions on this point, reading your essay. So I you remark on this, comment on this a little bit.
I knew nothing about space when I started working on this film. Originally, I wanted to talk about how in this film it was more directed to a kind of ethnic studies, multicultural studies direction about how, and also what's going on in indigenous studies about indigenous resurgence, and that is how older practices can be renewed, and how in this particular case, in a society undergoing and still the process of decolonization, one can bring in practices from the past that in a way are more fitting than European or North American practices around rights and legal frameworks and so on. But then I realized this film was about this kind of sacred space. That's the title of the film. And I read a lot of literature on the film, and nobody talked about sacred space. Not one. It was all about the genital cutting issue, which is, front and center in the film, but that's not what I think the film was ultimately about. So then I realized I knew nothing. I knew nothing about the subject. I had Foucault's suggestive essay, but there's no empirical literature there. There's nothing. So I went through all of these texts familiar to Massimo Rosati and anyone who works on these things. I spent a year reading. And then I realized what was driving me and my interest in the film was the political agency of space, of sacred space or heterotopic space. Because of my interest in the non-human, the relation between the human and non-human, what struck me was its agency, the agency of this space, and how it changes the actions, empowers certain actions, disempowers other actions, and changes the relationship among the spaces around it. And so that became central to me. So less interested in the symbolic social order aspect and more interested in what these spaces do, right? And politically, what they do. Politically, what is possible, like in that little excerpt from the Occupy movement protesters. So I'm interested in how to renew democratic life. And these kinds of spaces, I think, will be increasingly important because we're seeing their erosion, around the invasion of Gaza. People on the right and left are divided, obviously, but people on the left are divided. Jews are divided. But not just in this instance, what happened during the pandemic, it's become harder and harder to feel safe to speak out, to feel safe to be this kind of person in some social space. You won't be attacked because you're this rather than that. So the safe side of these spaces is becoming increasingly important, but also the availability of spaces in which people can experiment with the kind of person they are and the kind of person they want to be, the kinds of community that can be formed when such spaces provide sufficient refuge that one can experiment and create maybe new rituals, for example. So that's my interest in the spaces that we call sacred spaces that might differ from Rosati and the kind of literature he was interested in.
But can they be designed intentionally?
Can they?
Can this kind of refugee and sacred spaces, could they be intentionally designed in order to exactly trigger that kind of social political effect?
Absolutely. I think that's what that example from Occupy showed, that you can, but you can't just do it freely, right? What are the symbolic tools available or resources available to you? How are you going to organize it? How will it be consistent? I mean, if one of those students had spoken out, right, it would have collapsed the sacred space. If one of them had said, I can't believe what you did, any kind of, just to speak out, but they didn't. So there is a way, I think, if you create call it the symbolic order that is appropriate to the particular kind of space you're creating. There has to be some kind of correspondence. In this case, they were. And the other part of it that is important to me is that that space wasn't occupied because it's an existing space through conquest or violence or in some form of domination. And so, yeah, I think it can be, but I think people have to want to do it.
It is, well, yesterday you spoke about different forms of agency there, and Hartmut Rosa uses the image of the media passivity or media activity, this idea that you may have a form of agency that is a bit more passive, more intentional, maybe more designed than other forms of agency, because in that situation, people sort of, without telling each other, well, we have to be silent, they found a way to be more effective by...
Oh, there was an agreement ahead of time.
There was...
No, it was all intentional. It was an accident.
Okay.
No, it was intentional. We are going to hold this space in this form.
Okay.
And we're going to make her walk through. They knew that when she exited there was a press conference, and she would exit from those doors. And they knew if they created two lines of students, that she would have to walk through in between them, face them, that she couldn't avoid facing them. But the faces they saw were not faces of revenge, violence, or resentment. They were just reverential faces. They just sat there with their candles and looked at her without hatred, right? And so she was like, oh my God. And you saw her, she was bowing her head like she was walking through a temple. She was bowed, humbled, probably humiliated. And when the journalist at the end asks her, were you threatened? No, which completely collapsed her whole strategy of controlling students' protests through police measures. So, that's a ritual that has the symbolic element and the sort of holding that space receptively and forcing her to, and not forcing her because it's not done violently, right? But she can't but experience these criticisms that are coming at her, but in a completely unexpected way. So yes, they can be designed, and so in effect, what you see is the withdrawal of a kind of human agency, the typical human agency that is expressed in protest. You can't do that to us. This isn't justice. This isn't right. We want our freedom. So that moment is withdrawn, and they let the space be agentic, right? They let the space work on her. So they're humans, they're there, and they're, part of it, but they're holding themselves back. They're pulling the human agency away so that the non-human agency can manifest itself on this president who was convinced that the students represented a physical threat to the university and its people.
I don't know maybe because I'm too optimistic, but the lesson we drew from the pandemic experience was this idea that you can be morally creative even when you don't have the decision, for example, to avoid other people in order to make them safe. It was an interesting example of no agential moral agency and for moral creativity. That was interesting because you have to saw it that way. Yes, the idea.
I think, you know, the pandemic was in some ways a good reason to feel hopeful, because the great majority of people followed the guidelines, had vaccinations, took care, were respectful. There was a loud minority that were not. But I can tell you that whether you personally experienced it or not, a lot of people expressed fatigue with that.
Yeah.
And I worry very, very much that the next time around, and there will be a next time, there won't be so much buy-in. Because by the end, there were people who were really fed up and saying, I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to have another vaccine. I'm not going to keep masking. I'm not going to do this. And, you know, you get on a plane now, somebody might wear a mask, but still, I mean, it's not a pandemic, it's endemic. It's still a threat to us. But people got tired of the measures. And I'm not optimistic that when the next pandemic hits us, that there will be that much buy-in. There will be more revolt, I think, more rebellion of the wrong kind, or negativity, but I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, moral agency is exhausting.
Okay. Thank you. Again, we are reaching the end of our time. Yeah, if there are no other questions, I think we can close this session. I would like to thank again a lot Nikolas Kompridis for joining us. And I would like to remind you about the next seminar of this series that will be next week, 27, at the University Roma 3, with Alessandro Testa, Maria Chiara Giorda, Giorgio Ferri, and Ignazio Butilla on precisely ritual and rituality in the history and culture of Europe, moving from 3 recent volumes by Alessandro Testa. So we will meet there. Thank you all for participating today, and have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.